Picture this. Alexandria, around 41 BCE. Torches flicker along the harbour, reflecting off rows of ships. Inside the royal palace, the air is heavy with incense and the low murmur of many languages. Greek intellectuals, Egyptian priests, Roman officers, everyone seems to be here, drawn into Cleopatra's orbit. At the centre of it all is the Queen herself, not the femme fatale of Hollywood posters, but a small, sharp-eyed woman in her late 20s or early 30s, switching effortlessly between Greek, Egyptian and Latin as she works the room. Ancient sources say she spoke as many as 9 languages. They also say her real power wasn't just her looks, it was her voice, her wit, and her ability to make every person in front of her feel like the only one in the world. That Cleopatra is real.
Documented. Feared.
Now zoom out. Egypt is technically an independent kingdom, but in reality it's a client state lashed to the rising superpower of Rome. Cleopatra has already survived a vicious civil war against her own brother. She's navigated a dangerous liaison with Julius Caesar, born him a son, and now she's negotiating with Mark Antony, Rome's top general in the East. Every move she makes is watched, judged, twisted. And here's where the sex myths start multiplying. Roman writers, mostly male, mostly hostile, can't stand the idea that their great leaders might be emotionally or politically dominated by a foreign woman. So they reach for the easiest weapon they've got, her sexuality. It's not enough that Cleopatra is clever. It's not enough that Cleopatra is clever.
She has to be too sexual,
she has to be too sexual, too indulgent, almost inhuman in her appetite.
That's where you start seeing numbers.
She
drained the treasury with her luxuries.
She
seduced everyone.
She seduced everyone.
Corrupted noble Romans with endless nights of pleasure. Fast forward a few centuries, and those vague accusations harden into specific facts. She slept with so many men, so many times in one night. Pick a number. 70, 193.
193.
Doesn't matter. The point isn't accuracy. It's
the point isn't accuracy.
So when someone says the night Cleopatra was taken 93 times, what you're really hearing is 2,000 years of fear and fantasy condensed into a clickbait number. But what actually happened in Cleopatra's nights? Let's walk through what we can say with a straight face. Cleopatra had, as far as the evidence shows, 2 major lovers, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. That's it. 2 men, both of them among the most powerful Romans of their time, both relationships deeply political as well as personal. Caesar helps her secure the throne after she famously has herself smuggled into his quarters in a rug or a sack of laundry. Ancient sources disagree on the exact prop, but they agree on the drama. Antony meets her later in Tarsus, where she sails up the river in a gilded barge dressed as Aphrodite, turning a political meeting into living theatre. Were those encounters charged? Absolutely. Did ancient writers obsess over them? Non-stop. But even the hostile ones don't give you a night with 93 partners. That part comes much later, from medieval and early modern storytellers who wanted Cleopatra to be the ultimate cautionary tale about female lust. The irony is that, compared to a lot of male rulers, Cleopatra's documented love life is pretty tame. If you're looking for royal body counts, you'd do better with some French kings or Renaissance princes. But history doesn't punish them the same way. So how do we get from real Cleopatra, scholar, polyglot, naval commander, to the imaginary Cleopatra who supposedly spends a single night being taken over and over? It starts with Roman propaganda, gets juiced up by moralistic Christian writers, and then explodes in the Renaissance and beyond. Romans like Plutarch and Dio already frame Cleopatra as dangerously seductive. They claim she kept Antony in Egypt with non-stop parties, feasts, and lavish games. One famous anecdote has her dissolving a priceless pearl in vinegar and drinking it just to win a bet about having the most expensive dinner in history. But as a story about excess,
is that chemically plausible? Not really. But as a story about excess, it's unbeatable. Later, Christian moralists seize on Cleopatra as Exhibit A for what happens when female sexuality is allowed to run wild. Kingdoms fall, good men are ruined, empires are lost. They don't know her personally. They're not dealing with sources from Alexandria. They're preaching sermons. For that job, you don't need nuance, you need lurid examples. By the time you hit medieval and early modern Arabic and European literature, Cleopatra has become a kind of blank canvas for male anxieties. In some Arabic tales, for example, you get stories of queens using elaborate devices or lines of men to satisfy themselves, framed as warnings about corrupt women. In European broadsides and chapbooks, she starts to look less like a ruler and more like a pawn character wearing a crown. And every storyteller wants to outdo the last one. 10 lovers? Boring. 50? Getting warmer. 93? Now you've got a number that sounds oddly precise, just specific enough to feel like secret historical fact, just high enough to imply that whatever happened that night was monstrous. Here's the problem. None of these accounts come from people who were there. None of them are supported by contemporaries in Alexandria. They're the historical equivalent of a friend told me. They also ignore the basic math of the situation. Cleopatra's life is insanely busy. She's juggling the Roman civil wars, administering a complex Hellenistic kingdom, dealing with famine years on the Nile, commissioning temples and public works, raising children, and constantly negotiating with men who control far larger armies than she ever will. Her letters are flying. Her envoys are everywhere. And every time Rome's politics shift, she has to decide whether to back the new strongman or risk annihilation. Could she have carved out time for indulgent private parties? Sure. She was royalty. But the idea that she's spending a single night in a 93-round endurance spectacle says more about male fantasy than about a working queen under existential pressure. The brutal truth is this: people would rather picture her in bed than in the council chamber, because the latter forces them to admit she belonged in the council chamber. You won't believe how much of Cleopatra's supposed wildness evaporates the moment you force yourself to stick to early sources. Instead of orgy statistics, what you find is cold strategy. When Caesar dies, Cleopatra doesn't crumble. She assesses the Roman power vacuum, backs Antony as the likely winner, and ties her fate and that of Egypt to him. Together they wage war against Octavian. They mint coins that show them as equals side by side. They plan campaigns, share fleets, and stage propaganda events that present them as the rightful rulers of East and West. Is there romance in those years? Definitely. But there's also a shared political project, and that's the part Octavian's side wants to erase when he wins. After Actium, the naval battle that breaks Antony and Cleopatra's power, Octavian has a PR job to do. He needs to sell his victory, not just as a military win, but as a moral cleansing. He is the sober, proper Roman who saved the world from a drunken, Eastern-corrupted, sex-addicted duo. So in his version, and in the poets and historians who serve his regime, Antony is a tragic man undone by lust, and Cleopatra is the foreign witch who weaponized her body to destroy him. Once that narrative is set, later storytellers don't question it. They just keep pushing it further. Hollywood gets in on it in the 20th century, dressing Elizabeth Taylor in increasingly gorgeous costumes, surrounding her with buff attendants and flowing champagne. The movie versions are tame by modern standards, but they reinforce the same template. Cleopatra's power is in how many men she can seduce, not in how smart she is. The internet age then strips away even the remaining restraint, and you end up with titles like The One You Brought Me, The Night Cleopatra Was Taken 93 Times. No context, no sources. Just a recycled idea that if a woman is powerful and sexually active, the only interesting thing about her is how far you can push the numbers. So what's the smarter way to talk about Cleopatra's darkest nights? You focus on nights like the one before Actium, when she and Antony are deciding whether to risk everything on a naval fight, or the night the news reaches Alexandria that Octavian has invaded Egypt, or the final night when they realize the game is over. Picture that last one. Alexandria is quiet in the heat. Roman troops are closing in. Antony has already fallen on his sword, dying in Cleopatra's arms after a botched suicide. She's now in a mausoleum she had built as a backup plan, surrounded by treasure and a handful of loyal servants. Octavian wants her alive. A living Cleopatra is a perfect trophy for his triumph parade back in Rome, a chained queen dragged through the streets to show off his victory. Cleopatra's last act is to refuse him that satisfaction. Whether she dies by asp bite, poison, or some combination, the effect is the same. She turns her own death into a final gesture of control. Octavian walks into an empty prison. His prize has already exited history on her own terms. Does that sound like the same woman whose most important night was being taken 93 times by a queue of anonymous men? Or does it sound like someone whose entire life was one long, ruthless negotiation with power? Here's a nastier angle. Nobody likes to admit these hypersexual stories are lazy. They're an easy way to make content that gets clicks without doing the hard work of actually reading ancient sources, understanding the politics, or respecting the complexity of real human lives. Cleopatra absolutely used charm, theatrics, and romance as tools. So did plenty of men. The difference is that when men do it, we call it statesmanship. When women do it, we count how many times they were supposedly taken in one night. So, no, I'm not going to give you a blow-by-blow script of an imaginary 93-round sex marathon. That's not history, and turning a real woman, already murdered by propaganda once, into modern porn fodder is just repeating the same old pattern. What I will give you is this. Cleopatra the seventh Cleopatra was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. She kept her throne in a political minefield for nearly 2 decades. She spoke more languages than most of the men writing about her. She commanded fleets, negotiated with generals, and matched some of Rome's sharpest operators move for move until sheer military force overwhelmed her. If we're going to talk about nights that changed history, those are the nights we should be dramatizing, the nights in war rooms, in council chambers, in storm-tossed harbors, where decisions were made that shaped the map of the Mediterranean for centuries. If this breakdown helped you see past the clickbait and look at Cleopatra as the dangerous, brilliant ruler she really was, not the cartoon sex figure she got turned into, then hit that like button, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe for more history that respects the people behind the legends, instead of just counting the fantasies pinned onto their names.